At 24, he held a diploma and a restless certainty that he was missing something. Phil Knight felt untethered, the way a lot of recent graduates do, bright, mobile, and oddly unsure what to do next. He had tried law school and found it lukewarm. He was a runner by disposition, not just by habit, someone who found order and momentum in miles tracked and races run. It was that private discipline, that ritual of effort, that pushed him toward one of the least likely beginnings of a global empire, a chance conviction that the right running shoe could change everything. He met Bill Bowerman at the University of Oregon, where Bowerman was more than a coach. He was an inventor of performance. Bowerman treated a track shoe the way a mechanic treats an engine, a system of parts that could be improved, tuned, and perfected. For Phil, who lacked a clear career, Bowerman's curiosity offered a direction. For Bowerman, Phil's energy offered a kind of practical optimism, someone willing to hustle, test, and sell. What followed feels like a series of small, stubborn decisions that, stitched together, became an improbable climb. Phil took a trip to Japan, a short ambition disguised as a scouting mission. In Kobe, he encountered a brand that many in the United States hadn't noticed yet, Onitsuka Togger. These were not the leather, rigid shoes that dominated American shelves. These were lighter, more flexible, and designed specifically for the kind of running that mattered to competitive athletes. Phil saw potential. The Japanese shoes might be the superior product the U.S. market didn't yet know it needed. He returned with samples and a very audacious plan. He didn't build a storefront or lease a warehouse. He started a company that's name would come to mean something different a few years later, Blue Ribbon Sports. Phil sold shoes out of the trunk of his car at track meets. He drove from meet to meet, carrying boxes, convincing skeptical runners to try something unfamiliar. That image, a young entrepreneur opening his car's trunk and offering a stranger the promise of better performance, became the first very human chapter of a corporate story that would later look like destiny. Bowerman was not an administrator or salesman. He was a tinkerer. In his garage, on a kitchen table, he sliced and glued and experimented, trying new sole patterns, new materials, dropping pieces of rubber onto molds and watching how they affected traction and comfort. Product innovation at that point was coarse and quick. It was trial and error, not focus group engineering. When runners complained about blisters, Bowerman adjusted padding. When they wanted lighter weight, he shaved ounces where he could. The partnership between Phil's restless selling and Bowerman's obsessive refinement formed the company's core. One hand pushing product into a skeptical market, the other making the product worth pushing. Sales moved slower than optimism, but they did move.
The running boom that began in the 1960s. More Americans taking up jogging for fitness, more local races and collegiate competitions created a growing audience. Blue Ribbon catered to enthusiasts, persuading them that these Japanese designs offered better performance than European alternatives. Phil worked nights and weekends, sometimes driving to a college meet to sell a dozen pairs directly from his truck. The sales model was intimate, almost conspiratorial, a handshake, a fitting, an explanation about sole geometry and weight. It was grassroots marketing before the term existed. Jeff Johnson joined the small team early on. He became a voice inside the company who understood narrative and taste. He suggested the name that would stick, Nike, named, as the story goes, after the Greek goddess of victory. Johnson's recommendation landed amid a swirl of ideas and half-jokes, but it crystallized something essential. A brand doesn't just describe a product, it promises an outcome. It promised speed, triumph, and identity for anyone who slipped those shoes on. The logo, the simple curved check that would later be everywhere, was the work of a student designer. According to the account passed down in company histories, a student was paid a modest fee, reported as $35, to create that mark. The moment felt almost trivial, a small payment for a simple sketch, but it would become one of the most recognizable symbols on the planet. But these early triumphs were also riddled with tension. Blue Ribbon's dependence on Onitsuka was a structural vulnerability. The Japanese firm supplied the shoes, and Phil distributed them. For a time, this arrangement worked because Onitsuka needed an American foothold, and Phil had the willingness to pursue it obsessively. However, when a supplier holds the factory and the distributor holds the marketplace, the balance can tilt quickly. What happens when your supplier finds a better deal elsewhere? What do you do when the relationship that allows you to exist becomes competitive or fragile? That question wouldn't be theoretical for long. As Blue Ribbon scaled beyond trunk sales and began to capture real market attention, the stakes changed. The company invested time and reputation into promoting Onitsuka's designs. Runners began to identify Blue Ribbon's Olympic-style hustle with a particular type of shoe. Bowerman's early prototypes and Phil's direct sales had created demand. Yet supplier loyalty is often transactional. Manufacturers look to optimize their own distribution and profits. Reports and recollections describe a gradual souring. Exclusivity agreements loosened, alternative distributors appeared, and the tacit trust that had powered the partnership frayed. The business had outgrown the original handshake. This is the moment where small businesses often choose a defensive posture, double down on distribution, litigate, or try to realign incentives.
Phil and his team chose a different, more radical path. They decided to design and build their own shoe. That choice was not just tactical, it was existential. If your supplier can cut you off at any time, then owning the product and the means of production becomes not only an economic option, but a survival strategy. The pivot from distributor to manufacturer is deceptively complex. Manufacturing requires capital, overseas relationships, and technical competence. It requires convincing factories to trust an American upstart with molds, materials, and deadlines. It requires quality control and logistics, getting boxes shipped, customs cleared, inventory managed. And all of this needed to be done while protecting a nascent brand and keeping the customers sourced from the trunk and track meets satisfied. In the early phase of that reinvention, the team moved fast. Jeff Johnson's Nike suggestion solidified into branding direction. The swoosh, simple, energetic, began to appear on prototypes. Phil, who had found his sense of purpose in selling and strategy, now had to orchestrate a new kind of effort, recruiting manufacturers, redesigning supply lines, and financing production runs. Bowerman continued to refine the product, now guiding the creation of shoes meant to bear the company's own mark, rather than the tag of a Japanese supplier. This period has the rhythms of a thriller. There are long, anxious nights negotiating with factories whose owners spoke different languages and kept different calendars. There are hands-on inspections of rubber compounds and stitch patterns, and near-obsessive notes on the fit of the last, the form on which the shoe is built. There are budget spreadsheets that look dangerously optimistic compared with the invoices arriving from shipping companies. Phil's role evolved, less a trunk seller and more a CEO in the making, navigating contracts, projecting cash flows, and coaxing investors to risk their savings on a name no one had heard of. Sales momentum helped. A model that would later be identified as pivotal, the Cortez, found traction with a broader audience. It combined Bowerman's product innovations with a shape and price point that resonated beyond competitive runners. Reports of the period described the Cortez as a breakthrough, accessible, comfortable, and stylish enough to translate into a general consumer preference. The success of that model allowed the company to experiment with retail presence rather than relying solely on meets and catalogs. It justified employing sales reps, building a nominal storefront, and reinvesting revenue into design and inventory. With each step, the company's identity shifted. It was no longer just Blue Ribbon peddling imported shoes. It was becoming a brand with its own design language and market ambitions. And yet growth increases visibility, which attracts competition and scrutiny. As the business pivoted toward manufacturing and brand building, Onitsuka's posture changed. The legal and commercial entanglements that had seemed manageable during the trunk-selling era became combustible. Allegations of contract breaches and disputes over distribution began to surface. Some accounts describe Onitsuka moving to partner with other distributors in the U.S. Others describe miscommunications that escalated into threats of legal action. For Phil, the stakes were no longer academic. This was about whether his company could exist on its own terms. Faced with that pressure, the response had to be forceful and definitive. Design your own brand, own your production, and control your narrative. The internal debates were intense, as one might expect. There were financial risks. Building molds and negotiating minimums with factories requires capital that a small company often doesn't have. There were logistical risks. Foreign factories were sometimes inconsistent with delivery and quality. There were reputational risks. If the first independent product flopped, Blue Ribbon risked losing not only revenue, but credibility with a customer base built on trust and performance. Yet the decision to press on carried something deeper than spreadsheets. It carried a refusal to be defined by someone else's priorities. Phil's early ambiguity about life had given way to a kind of stubborn entrepreneurial clarity. If the path ahead was uncertain, at least it would be one they had chosen. This psychological shift, moving from lostness to deliberate direction, would become a recurring theme in the company's story. It's the reason the narrative works. It links personal vocation to corporate ambition, turning a founder's restlessness into a brand's daring. Small scenes from this era feel cinematic precisely because of their combination of intimacy and consequence. Picture a college student sketching a simple curve at a kitchen table, while a handful of men debate whether they can afford to order their first run. Picture a garage where Bowerman slices rubber, measuring the difference a millimeter makes. Picture Phil sitting on a radiator in a cheap apartment, running projections on the back of an envelope and wondering if the next shipment will arrive intact.
These are not the flashier moments that PR departments highlight. They are the ragged, messy hours where brands are actually made. Alongside these scenes runs a broader cultural current that helped the company. The running boom of the 1960s and 70s shifted the athletic shoe from niche equipment into everyday culture. Jogging became an act of self-improvement, and the right shoe became part of a person's identity. Sports marketing, still in its infancy, began to show that an endorsed athlete can make a product aspirational. Blue Ribbon, and then Nike, operated not only in product markets, but in a cultural transformation. Fitness moved from track to sidewalk to shopping mall. Sneakers moved from athletic gear to fashion and lifestyle.
This cultural backdrop mattered because it meant that a breakthrough product or a clever marketing move could compound. When a shoe resonated, it could do so among runners, among students, and among people who simply wanted to identify with a certain vigor. Phil's task was to harness that cultural momentum without overstating it, to build a brand that felt credible to athletes and desirable to the broader public. But the company's ascent was not linear. As they started to produce their own shoes, new problems emerged: quality control issues, misaligned shipments, and the constant cash crunch of manufacturing. Distributors who once cooperated suddenly became competitors. Onitsuka's contractual moves forced the company into legal postures that drained attention and resources. The pivot toward ownership of product may have been strategically inevitable, but it came with a price: more risk, more exposure, and a higher burden of responsibility. In the midst of these operational headaches, internal culture developed. The team that had once been a handful of friends and collaborators hardened into an organization with roles and lines of authority. Phil's leadership style, blunt and driven, contrasted with Bowerman's obsessive focus on product. Jeff Johnson added flavor and marketing intuition. Together, they embody a classic entrepreneurial triangle: vision, craft, and narrative. Each had a different relationship to risk. Phil took the financial gambles. Bowerman took the product risks. Johnson took the reputational gambles. When those risks paid off, the company felt invincible. When they failed, the result was sleepless nights and urgent meetings. By the time the name Nike began to appear on prototypes and promotional material, the company had already moved along a fast track from trunk sales to brand ambition. That name, suggested by Johnson and embraced by the team, changed how the business talked to the market. Blue Ribbon had been a modest, almost literal name. Nike promised myth, victory, and aspiration. The swoosh gave the brand a visual shorthand. It was small in the beginning, a curiosity on the side of a shoe, but symbols have a way of compounding meaning when attached to performance. Every race won, every satisfied runner added associative weight to the mark. Even as symbolism built, the practicalities of production intruded. The company had to find factories willing to make shoes to their specifications, often in countries where industrial oversight was limited and communications were challenging. Shipping timelines were brittle. Minimum order quantities meant that mistakes were costly. Quality assurance became a constant. At the same time, demand was growing. The Cortez and other early models were taking off in certain markets, pulling inventory hotly and creating the need for larger-scale operations.
This is where the narrative thickens into a classic turning point. The company is no longer small and nimble, but not yet mature enough to manage complexity at scale. Its choices during this window would define its trajectory. Could they secure reliable manufacturing? Could they manage cash flow while fulfilling orders? Could they protect their brand from legal attack and build a marketing engine powerful enough to carry ambition into the mainstream? Tension rises here for a reason. Every story about reinvention needs a challenge that tests the new identity. For Nike, still in the process of becoming Nike, that challenge was manifold. Supplier betrayal had already nudged them to become makers rather than sellers. Now, the cost of being a maker, finance, logistics, and legal exposure pressed hard. The optimism that had fueled trunk sales was now in conversation with the very practical demands of running a manufacturing and marketing business. What do you do when the people who once supplied your lifeblood suddenly look like rivals? How do you protect your customers when a supplier threatens to pull the product you've built your reputation on? And perhaps more importantly, what kind of company do you want to be when the comfortable simplicity of selling someone else's product gives way to the responsibility of being accountable for every stitch? Those questions drove the next phase of decision-making. The story up to this point: aimless graduate, chance discovery in a Japanese shop, trunk sales and tinkering, a breakthrough model, and then a decisive pivot toward owning the product, frames Phil Knight's arc from lostness to a purposeful pursuit. But the arc is not yet complete. The company had decided to build, brand, and ship its own shoes. It had a name, a logo, and a small but passionate market. Yet the real test,
confronting the legal, financial, and ethical complexities of scaling manufacturing and global distribution was still unfolding. As they prepared to navigate that next perilous stretch, the team had one clear advantage: a belief that product and story together could create momentum. The danger was that belief, when paired with inexperience and stretched resources, could blind them to real risks. Manufacturing could be inconsistent, contracts could be ambiguous, competitors could use regulatory and commercial levers to slow them down. But the alternative, refusing to own their destiny, had already been rejected. Phil and his colleagues had decided to take control, for better or worse. It is in this interstice, the moment after naming and initial grand cementing, before the larger crises arrive, that a company's character is forged. Would they be nimble, accountable, and ethical as their scale increased, or would the pressure to grow expose corners cut and complicate the moral calculus of overseas production and fast expansion?
The path forward required not only business savvy, but clarity of values. And that clarity is rarely simple when millions of dollars and reputations are on the line. For now, the narrative pauses on the threshold. The team had its name, its early successes, and its first independent products taped with the swoosh. Manufacturers were being courted, molds were being ordered, first runs were being scheduled. The company had made the pivotal transition from distributor to creator. But making that transition meant stepping into a world of legal entanglements, tariffs, and global labor practices that would test the company's resolve and conscience in ways they had not yet imagined. If the early days were about finding a purpose, turning aimlessness into a mission, what came next would be about the cost of that mission. Phil Knight had found his direction. The shoes were on their way out the door. What he did with the next invoices, the next lawsuits, and the next headlines would define whether that direction led to enduring success, complicated legacy, or both. If you like business origin stories, hit subscribe. There are more of these deep dives ahead. The decision to own the product had released a new energy inside the company. It was no longer simply about convincing a runner to try something different. It was about proving in every stitch and shipment that Blue Ribbon, soon to be Nike, could deliver performance and trust at scale. But ambition has a way of attracting trouble. In the months that followed, the company discovered that building a global brand meant navigating unfamiliar terrain, international manufacturing, customs law, and the fierce politics of distribution. One of the sharpest tests arrived not from a rival on the track, but from a government office. As Nike pushed to increase its imports and broaden its manufacturing relationships, U.S. customs officials began to reevaluate how imported footwear should be valued for tariff purposes. The heart of the dispute lay in a technical but brutal bureaucratic concept: the American selling price. In practice, customs officials sought to assign a higher domestic equivalent value to shoes being imported, which retroactively increased duties owed on past shipments. For a company operating with the narrow cash margins of a young manufacturer, the effect was devastating. Contested assessments of duty owed can be applied to prior shipments, multiplying into sums that dwarf ordinary invoices. According to reports in company accounts and period coverage, Nike was hit with a claim that amounted to a reported $25 million in duties, figure to verify. For a company that had only recently graduated from car trunk sales, this was an existential shock. It forced a fundamental question: fight in the courts and risk bankruptcy, or negotiate and accept a hit that might shock investors and suppliers alike? What followed was a grueling mix of legal maneuvering and public relations.
The company fought the assessment, arguing both technical positions about valuation and broader assertions about their financial capacity to meet retroactive demands. At the same time, Phil and his team had to keep factories humming, invoices paid, and retailers stocked. The tariff crisis pulled attention away from product innovation and into the mechanics of government negotiations. It also exposed a painful truth about rapid scale. The cost of being global is not abstract. It is a pile of notices from customs with deadlines attached. The crisis, as recounted in contemporary reporting and later reflections, was eventually resolved through a combination of litigation, negotiation, and public pressure. Nike did not vanish under the weight of the claim. Rather, it managed to negotiate a reduced settlement, terms reported in sources, some details to verify. The immediate relief was financial, but the longer-term lesson was organizational. The company retooled how it managed imports, invested in customs compliance, and began cultivating legal and financial expertise that a small distributor had not required. They learned to expect the unexpected: regulatory hazards, retroactive duties, tariff disputes. Those capacities would be essential as Nike moved from regional curiosity to multinational corporation. If the customs battle tested the company's financial resilience,
The next phase tested its marketing imagination. Having established product credibility among runners, Nike began to use narrative at scale. This was less about advertising and more about forging identity, the idea that a shoe could stand for achievement, effort, and personal transformation. Athlete endorsements, then a burgeoning tactic, offered a lever. When a high-profile athlete linked their performance to a brand's product, millions of consumers suddenly found a reason to desire that product beyond its technical merits. Nike's approach to endorsements was strategic and at times audacious. The company signed athletes who embodied athletic charisma and, crucially, cultural resonance. These partnerships did more than move inventory. They situated Nike inside public conversations about excellence. Some of the athlete relationships later became legendary case studies, most notably the collaboration with a rising basketball star whose Air Jordan line redefined both sneaker culture and marketing economics. That collaboration demonstrated how brand and athlete could co-create a cultural phenomenon. Limited edition models, narrative-driven struggles, and a halo effect that lifted the parent brand's prestige. The revenue effect and the cultural cachet created by such endorsements escalated Nike's trajectory, enabling expanded retail distribution and heavier investment in design and marketing. Growth accelerated. The company moved from being a niche supplier to a mainstream lifestyle brand. Sales teams grew, retail strategies diversified, and corporate structures matured.
An initial public offering, when the company went public, brought a new category of stakeholders and a different set of expectations. Public markets required quarterly explanations, investor relations, and a governance structure that the small, founder-led company had not needed before. For Phil, who had once operated on envelopes and handshake deals, navigating investors and stock market scrutiny was another form of reinvention. With the company's expansion came both economic opportunity and moral scrutiny. As Nike's designs and campaigns amplified, journalists and activists turned the spotlight on an uncomfortable question. What were the working conditions in the overseas factories that produced so many of Nike shoes? Beginning in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, investigative reports and activist accounts alleged poor working conditions, low wages, long hours, and in some cases exploitative labor practices in factories contracted by major sportswear brands. Nike, as one of the most visible players in that space, attracted sustained attention. Those reports were framed as allegations and investigative findings by journalists, activists, and documentary filmmakers, and they inflicted reputational damage that translated into commercial risk. Protesters picketed storefronts, university groups pressed their schools to divest, and media scrutiny forced public conversations about corporate responsibility. Nike's leadership confronted a paradox. The same globalized supply chain that enabled rapid growth also made the company vulnerable to ethical critique. The factories that kept inventory flowing were largely outside U.S. regulatory reach. That distance created both opacity and moral hazard. Nike's public response evolved over time and crucially included concrete reforms. Initially defensive, the company shifted toward engagement. It implemented codes of conduct for suppliers, established monitoring systems, and over the years, moved to increase transparency about supplier relationships. Nike reports and subsequent documentary coverage describe an iterative process. New policies, third-party audits, cooperation with non-governmental organizations, and investments in on-the-ground compliance. The company's leadership acknowledged failures and framed reforms as ongoing commitments, recognizing that policy and practice in global manufacturing required sustained oversight rather than a single corrective measure. Activists and critics continued to insist reforms were incomplete. Some praised the changes, others demanded deeper structural shifts. The story of labor reform at Nike is thus a story of contested progress, documented responses and improvements matched against persistent scrutiny and calls for accountability. What the controversy made clear was that branding and manufacturing are inseparable in the modern economy. A brand cannot claim ethical stature while outsourcing opacity.
Consumers increasingly demanded to know not just whether a shoe made someone faster, but how it was made and by whom. The reputational costs of ignoring those questions became palpable to even the most growth-focused management teams. In parallel with these ethical reckonings, Nike's marketing continued to evolve into a creative force. The company experimented with storytelling and advertising. It built narratives that linked product to identity. Bold campaigns moved beyond simple performance claims and entered cultural conversations. Sometimes that meant celebratory ads about triumph. Other times it meant positioning the brand inside social debates, choices that carried both risk and reward. A striking example of Nike's willingness to take social risk came decades later with a campaign that thrust the company into a highly polarized political moment. When Nike selected a prominent and polarizing athlete and activist as the face of a major Dream Crazy campaign, it knowingly courted controversy. The campaign's theme about sacrifice, protest, and pursuing ideals resonated with many consumers and alienated others. Social media exploded with both support and boycott calls. The practical business outcome was complex. Initial backlash included calls to destroy products and negative stories, but reports from multiple outlets noted a surge in online engagement and, for a period, increased sales among certain demographics. The episode encapsulated a growing reality for large brands. Taking a stance can heighten authenticity with a core audience while simultaneously provoking serious backlash. Nike's bet was that the net effect favored long-term brand salience and cultural relevance. Reports and company statements suggested the campaign increased brand attention and, by some measures, commercial momentum. Yet the episode also reinforced the idea that brand power comes with political and ethical dimensions that require careful navigation. Across all these phases, tariff battles, endorsements, labor controversies, bold campaigns, one theme recurs: reinvention. Nike's ability to reimagine itself, to shift from distributor to manufacturer, from regional curiosity to global brand, and from product-focused company to cultural storyteller explains much of its longevity. But reinvention was not apolitical or untroubled. It required choices that created winners and losers, stress-tested values, and provoked public debate. Throughout, the human element remained central. Phil Knight's arc from an aimless graduate to a founder presiding over a multinational corporation is not simply a tale of financial engineering. It is a story about how personal restlessness turned into managerial obsession, how a coach's curiosity translated into product breakthroughs, and how a small team's daring decisions accumulated into a global enterprise. Those human choices, imperfect, courageous, and sometimes blind to consequences, are what give the story its moral texture.
There were, of course, quieter moments that shaped the company's culture. Internally, leaders wrestled with governance as the firm scaled. A founder style that once drove daily operations had to be balanced against the institutional requirements of a public company. Hiring practices matured, financial controls were tightened, and a professional cadre of managers grew around the original founding trio. Phil's bluntness and Bowerman's craft sensibility continued to steer product development in many ways, but the company's identity became more diverse. Lawyers, auditors, designers, and brand strategists all had seats at the table. The tension between entrepreneurial ferocity and corporate discipline created productive friction and, at times, frustrating bureaucracy. Design and the obsessive pursuit of marginal gains remained a through line. Bowerman's early tinkering matured into formalized R&D. Nike's design teams began experimenting with late-stage technology. Different foam compounds, engineered meshes, and changes to the sole's geometry intended to deliver measurable improvements in performance and comfort. The language shifted from "we'll shave an ounce" to "we'll measure delta in milliseconds," but the spirit was continuous. Make better shoes, test them with athletes, iterate. This relentless focus on product is a key reason why endorsements worked when they did. Athletes prefer authenticity. They will not lend their names credibly to a product that fails. When Nike aligned its product promise with an athlete's performance narrative, the combination was persuasive. The company's collaborations with basketball and golf stars, among others, illustrated how product credibility plus cultural storytelling could create durable brand advantages. Those relationships, carefully cultivated and amplified by creative marketing, turned shoes into status symbols and athletes into brand authors. Yet, even as marketing and product aligned, the company had to confront the structural realities of globalization. Manufacturing hubs in Asia offered cost advantages and capacity, but they also raised questions about oversight and community impact. Labor activists highlighted that the benefits of low-cost manufacturing often accrued to companies and consumers in faraway markets, while workers in local factories faced precarious conditions. Nike's response, imposing codes, auditing suppliers, and sometimes terminating relationships, was partly moral and partly strategic. A brand's reputation is an asset. Protecting it required remediation. Over the years, Nike's approach to supplier responsibility matured into a more systematic program. The company built teams to monitor factory conditions, published lists of suppliers to increase transparency, and participated in multi-stakeholder initiatives aimed at improving labor standards.
These steps did not erase criticism. Many activists argued they were insufficient or uneven, but they represented an institutional shift away from denial and toward engagement. To critics, the changes sometimes felt like incrementalism. To supporters, they were evidence of a company learning from hard lessons and attempting to align its global footprint with broader ethical expectations. As Nike moved into the 21st century, those historical tensions persisted but found new expression. Consumer expectations evolved. Transparency became a market demand. Social media amplified critiques and could turn local issues into global headlines overnight.
Political polarization made brand stances more consequential, yet Nike's capacity to navigate these currents owed much to the company's earlier reinventions. It had built a marketing engine, mastered product storytelling, and learned to operate at scale under pressure. The modern legacy of the company is thus a composite: product innovation and branding genius on one hand, messy ethical questions and contested labor histories on the other. That complexity is not a flaw in the narrative, it is the narrative. Iconic brands are rarely untroubled. They are institutions that collect both admiration and critique as they grow. When we step back to the central arc, from loss to success, as the title frames it, Phil Knight's story reads as a study in directional choice. Early aimlessness gave way to a disciplined pursuit of a thesis that a better shoe plus better storytelling could capture a cultural moment. That thesis required iteration: importing, learning, designing, litigating, and marketing. Each contest, whether with a Japanese supplier, a customs office, or an activist group, forced the company to make consequential decisions. Sometimes those choices were defensive and reactive, sometimes they were bold and proactive. The cumulative result was a company that reshaped athletic culture, but also one that had to be accountable for the consequences of how it operated. There are a few practical lessons buried in the dense narrative of scale and controversy. First, control of the product matters. Phil's early insight that you cannot rely indefinitely on a supplier who can become competitive pushed Nike toward vertical control of design and brand. Second, brand is both narrative and reputation. A great product can be amplified by narrative, championships, athlete stories, and clever campaigns, but reputation can be damaged by hidden supply chains. Third, ethical responsibility is not peripheral, it is strategic. For global brands, labor conditions, environmental impact, and corporate transparency are not optional PR add-ons. They are central to long-term customer trust. Those lessons are not simple platitudes. They are operationally demanding. Instituting a supply chain monitoring regime costs money. Changing factory relationships disrupts production.
Taking a political stance can alienate portions of a market, yet the companies that survive and thrive are often those that accept these trade-offs and institutionalized mechanisms to manage them. In the final sweep of the story, it is worth returning to small images that capture the human scale of enormous corporate growth. Phil Knight's earliest sales were literal, opening a trunk and offering a runner a sample. Bowerman's experiments were manual, tactile, and rooted in a coach's obsession with marginal gains. A student's simple sketch became an icon, paid for with a modest fee that later felt almost mythical. These humble acts, selling directly, cutting rubber in a garage, sketching a curve, compound into global consequences when matched with ambition and timing. Nike's later cultural moments, endorsement deals that turned athletes into global icons, campaigns that forced public debate, and manufacturing choices that prompted ethical reckonings, show how a company's identity evolves and how public expectations evolve with it. The swoosh came to mean many things: performance, aspiration, controversy, and ultimately, resilience. Any unvarnished account must acknowledge the messiness. Success in this narrative is not a clean victory lap. It is an accumulation of trade-offs, mistakes, and corrections. Phil Knight's journey from lost graduate to the founder of a company that would redefine sports marketing is inspirational precisely because it refuses simplicity. It is both the story of audacity and the story of consequences. So what does this mean for an entrepreneur watching the arc from the outside? Perhaps the clearest takeaway is the interplay of product excellence and ethical awareness. You can start with a great idea, a better shoe, a cleaner interface, a smarter delivery model. But scaling that idea requires structural attention to systems you do not initially control: supply chains, regulatory regimes, public narratives. Building technical competence in these domains is as essential as having the original product conviction. The second takeaway is psychological. Uncertainty can be a productive engine. Phil's restlessness pushed him into situations where decisions were necessary. That discomfort can be harnessed as a creative force, provided it is tempered by learning and institutional adaptation. In the end, Nike's story is an instructive paradox. The same ambition that allowed the company to seize cultural capital also exposed it to scrutiny and ethical obligations it had to learn to meet. The arc from lost to success did not erase failures or controversies. It forced them into the open and demanded responses. That mixture, innovation entwined with responsibility, is what makes the company and this story enduringly relevant. If you want to explore more brand origin stories like this one, check the links in the description for sources and related videos.
Subscribe for more deep dives into the history behind the world's most influential companies.